President Biden has a bust of your father in the Oval Office. When you see that, what do you think?
I'm honored by it. And, I have a lot of admiration for President Biden for the service that he's given to our country. I've known him. He's been my friend, my close family friend for 40 years. And, there's nothing personal about this campaign. I am not going to run a mean-spirited campaign or a personal campaign against President Biden. He and I just differ really dramatically on issues like the war, like censorship, the control of Wall Street and the big corporations of our federal government and the pharmaceutical companies, and also the use of fear as a governing tool. And I think our country's headed in a bad direction, and that's why I'm running, but not because I lack of personal affection for President Biden.
Is he too old to have a second term?
I don't think age should be a metric for us limiting presidential power. I mean, Bernie Sanders is 81, and, a lot of people would support him. So I think it really, the only question that we have when you get to a certain age is, do you have the mental acuity? And I am not going to judge President Biden's mental acuity. I'll leave that to other people.
I've just seen a poll that says you're at 19% among Democrats in a race against President Biden. At what point do you think he's obligated to debate you? I'm mindful of the fact that if it were a general election, the Commission on Presidential Debates has a threshold of 15%.
I mean, I think there should be debates. I think, particularly, Michael, at this time in history, there's so many Americans who are worried about election integrity, who have lost faith in election integrity and feel like the whole system, including the election system, is rigged against them. I mean, there was riots by people on Capitol Hill because of that, that driving conviction. So I think the political parties, both parties, ought to be doing everything that they can to convince the American public that we really have a democracy in this country, and that, our politicians are talking to people, are doing retail politics, are engaging in debates and town halls, and that it's not just a rigged system where the candidates are chosen by the political party the way that was done in the Soviet Union. So I'm hoping, even if I had 5%, I think it's important to do debates. But, that's
okay. But do you?
As a choice, I don't have any
so
control
far
over.
Understood. But would you go so far as to say that he has an obligation to debate you if you have a respectable showing in the polls and 19% is respectable?
I think he has an obligation to democracy to debate anyway. And I would hope that he does that. But I mean, you're a lawyer and I'm a lawyer. There's no legal obligation that the president has. I can't sue him for it. It's a decision by the party. And I would hope that the party would put democracy, would treasure and value our democracy. And it would at least, I think a lot of people are feeling like, the shroud has been lifted off of democracy now, and that, it's all kind of fake and it was all rigged. And I think we need to be doing everything that we can to persuade Americans that democracy in this country is real.
I watched your announcement speech from Boston, all 2 hours of it, at about the 48 or 49 minute mark. At about the 48 or 49 minute mark, you said,
"This is what happens when you censor somebody for 18 years. I got a lot to talk about.
Who censored you and why?
Well, most recently, the networks all censored me, including this network. But most recently, and I think most offensively, the White House was asking the social media sites to censor me. There were also attorney generals, I think 18 or 13 Democratic attorney generals who contacted the social media sites and asked them specifically to censor me. But, we now have, because of the Twitter files and because of these email dumps, we now have clear evidence that there were White House personnel who were ordering the social media companies to censor me, and it had nothing to do with misinformation. In fact, nobody's been able to show a single statement that I've ever made on my Twitter or any social media that is factually inaccurate. It was because I was dissenting from government policies. And, in this country, we built this country so that to allow our citizens to complain about our public officials. And that's,
Robert,
to me, a clear violation of the First Amendment.
so let's go there. The New York Times, then reporting on your announcement, said this: Mr. Kennedy is the latest in a history of fringe presidential aspirants from both parties who run to bring attention to a cause or to themselves. Do you embrace that label, fringe? And if not, what does fringe mean to you?
Well, I'm not running to bring attention to a particular cause. I'm running because I believe I'm going to win, or I have a good chance of winning, a good enough chance of winning to endure all the hardships that, a campaign imposes on me and my family. And I can tell you this, Michael, because I know that you're a big fan of my wife's, but if she did not think, if I had not convinced her that I can win this race, I would not be in it, because she's the ultimate boss.
Okay, listen, I do love your wife. I'm Team Cheryl. Having said that, she called you out on that Anne Frank reference.
Even in Hitler's Germany, you could cross the Alps into Switzerland. You can hide in an attic like Anne Frank did. I visited in 1962 East Germany with my father and met people who had climbed the wall and escaped. So it was possible. Many died doing it, but it was possible. Today, the mechanisms are being put in place that will make it so none of us can run and none of us can hide.
You then apologized. Can you and I agree that Nazi or Holocaust references are never appropriate, because then they diminish what truly transpired in the Holocaust?
Well, first of all, Michael, in that case, first of all, let me say, I agree that we have to be careful about how we invoke the Holocaust. But, it's a difficult, just on a theoretical or hypothetical basis. I don't know if you can have kind of hard and fast rules about that, because, I grew up in a generation where, right after the World War II, where everybody was saying, never again. And the only way that we make sure that that kind of barbarism doesn't happen again is if we're allowed to talk about it, and if we're allowed to, if we are able to recognize all the milestones of tyranny. And that exercise may require us at some point, and may be useful, to invoke historical wrongs, including the Holocaust, the American Native genocide, Black slavery, and the many atrocities in history. But I want to say something about that case. In that case, and that's a good example of the censorship, I never compared the COVID mandates or the COVID response to the Holocaust. That was a media canard, something that the media made up and charged me with. And what I was making a completely different point about the rise of the emerging rise of AI, of artificial intelligence and surveillance technologies, which was creating an infrastructure that in the future totalitarian systems would be able to surveil us and intrude and control our lives in ways that had never happened in the past. And so because
I know,
of that,
but you invoked,
let me just finish.
You invoked Anne Frank.
Well, I invoked her not comparing the Holocaust to the COVID mandates. I wasn't doing that. That's what the media reported. That was not true. And I ultimately, because of the damage that was happening to my family, and because I was living in a world where nothing I said was reported. So I was not allowed to defend myself. In fact, this is the first time I've ever been allowed to talk about it on TV. Nobody would talk to me. Nobody would allow me on. Nobody would invite me on and say, why did you say that? And ultimately, I had to apologize for something I never said.